Hello, I want to make a video about logic and paradoxes and conundrums again. I've made a video like this before, but I want to cover it from a kind of different point of view, like most of my videos. Covering the same simple concepts from a different point of view, looking at it from a different point of view, understanding it better, giving you a greater context of a situation. And that's why, another reason why I try to go over the same things over and over again to connect all these ideas together. And I apologize if it gets redundant, but that's the way it's going to be happening. That's the way the mechanism works. That's the way I want to explain these things so that they mean something in the greater context. That's what I'm doing. I'm explaining in the greater context, tying all these ideas together to make sure that there's a nice continuity to all these ideas that make sense, and how it can make sense, and how these ideas don't just necessarily contradict each other. So I try my best not to contradict myself when I explain all these ideas at once, and explaining them in the context of everything that I've said before, leading up to now and leading to forward to different ideas that I may come up with, or different points of view or context that I may look at something from. That's why I want to try my best to connect all these ideas as best I can to one another. So that's another thing. It goes back, that's a good segue into an idea that it doesn't need you to be there. It doesn't need the tree, like the tree in the forest. I think I've used this example before as well. Is that the tree in the forest doesn't need you to be there to experience it falling. It still falls. There's eternal logic. Something that doesn't make sense to you doesn't need to make sense to you. A paradox or whatever it may be, other than the word describing the very idea of something that can't exist. A paradox, the word describing it explains it can't happen. A paradox is just you coming up with contradictory ideas and saying that how is this going to work? These two contradictory ideas, how is this something that's going to work? But it does, obviously, if it's a paradox, and if it's say something isn't a paradox, even though we apply it to say something like a paradox, but it doesn't need you. The very fact that it exists explains its reality. It doesn't need you to understand it. It doesn't need you to see it. It doesn't need you to sense it. It's something that exists in and of itself, and it doesn't need you. So if you falsely say something's a paradox and it exists and it does happen, it doesn't need you to quite understand it for it to exist. But obviously the very reality of logic is understanding how everything exists and how everything functions from a point A to a point B to a point C, and leading in this logical continuity, leading from a straight line, leading forward, and having all these ideas connect. And that's the very idea. But just explaining, at least hypothetically from this kind of point of view, it doesn't need you to see it, doesn't need you to sense it, doesn't need you to understand it. Almost your sixth and seventh sense, perceiving and understanding things and understanding the context and everything about it. It doesn't need you to understand anything. It doesn't need you to understand anything or any of that kind of stuff. It doesn't need your definition. It doesn't need anything that you apply to it. It doesn't need your projection. It doesn't need your perception. It doesn't need your explanation. Your explanation is nothing but interactions. It's nothing but a diaphragm interacting with throat muscles it's nothing but voice explaining concepts based on this projection. It doesn't need your projection and your things. This voice and this description is coming from based on this projection, based on this physical process causing this projection, this voice. It doesn't need your voice. Your voice is just air coming out, interacting with muscles, vibrating muscles in your throat. It's nothing more than that, interaction. And it doesn't need your projection or the interaction of your explaining it, of the interaction in your throat muscles and your and the air interacting. It doesn't need that interaction for you to explain it or understand anything. It's going to exist, and it's going to make sense in and of itself by its very own existence. And if it's just a concept in your mind, or some kind of contradiction in your mind, it doesn't matter. It's something that exists, at least as an idea. And if it's something that doesn't necessarily exist in reality, say it's a paradox or a conundrum that it actually can be solved, and but by its very own definition, it's something that we just it's an idea of creating scenarios that can't be solved and asking why they can't be solved, and it's contriving scenarios that contradict each other, and just saying that, and then asking, well, how can this happen? When you're just contriving ideas, and you're contriving definitions, and you're contriving comparisons, and you're putting them together in situations where you know they can't happen, but you're doing it and asking why anyway, even though you know it can't happen. They're contradictory ideas, and that's this internal logic we go on. Why can't contradictory ideas work, but we're still expecting them to work? We're still expecting something greater beyond this point of view. We're still expecting revelations. Why isn't there anything beyond the revelation? I keep searching based on this mechanism that keeps me searching, this momentum. But there's nothing beyond the momentum that I'm experiencing, and I'm being part of the mechanism. I'm being played by the mechanism by falling for it every time. that there's always something more. It's based on this mechanism that I keep finding for something more, based on this internal logic that I base it on, saying, well, obviously there's something more to this A equals B equals B equals C, and it's just jumbled nonsense, not necessarily jumbled nonsense. Obviously there's a foundation in logic, explaining things like mathematics, but there's less of a foundation based on our internal logic that we have, based on our perception, based on this very mechanism that's playing us. We don't know it. This mechanism is playing us when we keep asking why, A equals B, B equals C. Where does Z equal? Does it lead back to A? Does it lead to something new? Well, obviously, you're just contriving that. You keep on contriving, asking questions. What's beyond the photon? Was there anything smaller than a photon? What's this? How do you get smaller? Is it infinite regression? And this infinite regression, all these ideas and all these expectations that we have, we're contriving them a lot in the same way that we're contriving these kinds of examples and describing, say, something like a paradox or conundrum or something like that, and trying to explain away or try to find some kind of greater intelligence beyond the fact that something can only be explained so much. And explaining it beyond that almost goes to the point of being impractical. And it makes it, you explain beyond the actual function of something. Obviously, we're just using words, and our words can describe something accurately or inaccurately. And sometimes when you describe it too much, you think you're getting somewhere, but you're not really getting anywhere. And that's based on this internal logic where we think that we're getting somewhere the more we explain something. You can be over-explaining something and not necessarily realize it, and that's all you're doing. Sort of like you're over-explaining something, you're expecting something out of, say, a revelation leading to another revelation based on this internal logic where that drives you, this logic, this mechanism that drives this internal logic that has no real foundation. Based on the mechanisms that's controlling you, you're being gamed by the game that's controlling you, by the mechanism controlling you, and you're being fooled by the mechanism that's controlling you, where you want to keep finding revelations, this momentum thing where you keep on looking for answers, the problem-solving mechanism that this very game is controlled by. It's leading to something that you want to find another answer, finding another answer. The more that you want to find another answer, beyond a certain point, based on even if you don't necessarily recognize the limits, it doesn't need you to recognize the limits to have the limits there that drive the point where you're finally at the point where it's impractical to keep asking that question. Because you can explain something beyond something or something beyond something, but at the point, it's irrelevant. It's beyond the point. It's based on these very fundamental mechanisms. It's based on these mechanical interactions leading to something big. Just because it's mechanical doesn't mean it can't mean anything more. Just because it's mechanical doesn't mean it's anything less. It's mechanical, but it means something greater in the outcome. It's mechanical, these processes that are happening, these processes. But it means something in the end regardless. It means something more. It's the sum of the parts is great. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And when it comes to this consciousness thing, it means something more, that I'm experiencing something than the very foundation that it means something. Sort of like, even though everything's a mechanical process, you can still get caught up in the game where you're still experiencing some kind of pleasure or some kind of experience that means something. Obviously, pain still means something. Pleasure can mean something, even if you're not, even if you recognize it. It could still mean something even if you're not necessarily caught up in the game, and it can still mean something regardless of your recognition or not. So it doesn't necessarily need your recognition, though, for it to mean anything. It doesn't need your interaction with this environment to have a certain way. Your interaction based on your perception, your projection, based on the sentience interacting, causing me to describe something a certain way based on these ideas, describing it in my head, having these ideas project out to reality. My voice decides to describe something. It doesn't need that description based on a physical interaction of irrelevant interaction with this environment. Obviously, it exists. Once I talk, it exists, but that doesn't mean what I'm saying is true. The talking exists, the thing exists, but me describing it can get lost in translation. I'm talking, I'm explaining something, I'm looking at something, the interaction is happening, the talking is happening, the interaction is happening, the perception's happening, that thing's happening, but what's coming out of my mouth doesn't necessarily mean it's true. I'm talking, and the talking is true, the thing out there is true, the interaction is true, but that doesn't mean what I'm saying is true. And it doesn't need your interaction. You're saying something, the interaction between your projection and your throat muscles in the air, it doesn't need that to describe something, and sometimes your description can be wrong, and that's exactly the point. Sometimes you can describe something beyond any kind of practical means, and you're describing it to a point where it leads nowhere. And sort of like it exists in and of itself in reality. It doesn't need you to sense it or understand it or anything. And if, say, like I mentioned before, if it's a paradox and it actually can exist, it's just a paradox by example, and we use that as an example, It doesn't need you to understand it, sort of like it doesn't need you to understand math. Math exists regardless. Sort of like a number of things exist. They can be human-made creations. It can be this-made creations. It can be unnatural creations, or whatever it may be. It can be something that's contrived, but it still exists, at least as an idea that happened sometime in the past or sometime in the future. That's going to happen. Obviously we don't know. We don't have context on the future, but there's going to be something that happens, even though I can't explain it or I'm not there to experience it. It's still going to happen, sort of like something happened before I died, or I existed, and there's something that's going to happen after I die. Something's going to happen. Existence, the very act that I'm dying, is something that's happening, and that's the fleeting thing. It's gonna fleetingly lead to something that's gonna exist and based on something that didn't exist, and we're caught up in the momentum, and it's gonna eventually lead to my death because that we're caught up in the momentum. I'm eventually gonna lead to an end, and that's something that's gonna happen. There's gonna be some end that's gonna happen, and even if I'm not here to exist it, I'm going to lead to it. My end is going to be an event in and of itself that leads to something for me not to exist, something beyond the end that I experience. And I'm going to fleetingly exist in this existence until I fleetingly reach the end that I'm going to reach. Something's going to inevitably happen, and it doesn't need me to be there to experience it. I'm going to be there to experience my end, because it's eventually going to happen. Something's going to lead there, and I'm going to experience the end that I have, and that's going to give context to a greater picture and understanding there's something beyond me, regardless of me being here, even if I'm not here to experience it. But that goes back to the cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, and that this idea that once you die, there's nothing beyond your perception, and that this perception is just an interaction with the environment, and these other projections don't merely mean anything beyond a certain point of existence. These other projections don't mean much. And these other projections are something that exists regardless of your existence. Obviously, you're not going to be able to sense them, and they don't exist to you. You don't exist anymore, but those things still exist. Just because your perception doesn't exist doesn't mean they don't exist. And since, obviously, in a way you can apply it, that once you don't exist, the universe is ended, to you at least, when describing the reality that we're living in. So, to a certain extent, that can be applied, but it's just looking from a different point of view, and that's all we can really do. Something exists, but from our point of view, a whole different context can be laid out and can exist. And it doesn't need your context to explain, though, the reality. And the reality is it's still existent regardless of your context existing. Obviously, the nature of reality is jumbling up these different ideas and different things, meaning having different contexts, but the context doesn't explain away the reality. The reality exists, sort of like the reality beyond my existence. There's something that's going to lead to a future. There's something that comes from a past. It doesn't need me to experience it, but I'm going to experience an eventual end that leads to something that leads to an end that leads to a greater context beyond my end. And I'm going to experience the end. I'm going to experience some end that means anything to me. And I experience the beginning, and I'm going to experience an end that means something to me. And that's the way it's going to happen. And there's going to be a greater context beyond that. So yeah, it doesn't need you to be there to understand it. It doesn't need your interaction to understand it. It doesn't need your words, your interaction with your psychology based on this mechanism of projection. It doesn't need this projection, this interaction, based on this projection to cause this interaction. Even if it's not this voice I'm having is based on this interaction, but not this sentience. It doesn't need this sentience for my voice to work. It doesn't need this interaction, sort of like unconsciously your voice says something. It doesn't mean it's right, but just because you're not aware doesn't mean what you're saying is wrong. It's completely disconnected from what you say and how you explain things from what you actually think. Sort of like how you actually think, your voice, you say something, you give a context, something you're unconscious. You don't have really any thoughts going on other than the fact that you're still thinking because you're existing. But to say you're talking beyond your death, a hypothetical situation, applying it to a hypothetical circumstance. It's still something that it doesn't mean what you're saying is wrong just because you're dead, but just because you're alive and experiencing something. Just because there's an interaction doesn't mean it's right either. It's happening, but it doesn't mean it's right. Just because you're dead doesn't mean it's wrong. And that explains away almost the concept that we're this thing that's driving us. We're not going to be looking for more once we die. And that once you say you explain something, you're not experiencing anything, but you say you're saying something, you get shot in the head and you say something for 5 seconds, your mouth keeps finishing your sentence. You say something explaining some kind of reality beyond your death, and you finish the sentence even though you died. You say another 10 words explaining something. It doesn't need your sentience to explain that something that means something, and you're not going to be looking for any more beyond the words that you say. But the words that you say can mean something regardless, or not mean something. The very existence of those words means something. The explanation means something in and of itself. It happened, but what you say doesn't mean it's right or wrong, regardless of you being alive or not being alive. It's just an interaction, and you're describing something as best you can based on an interaction within the game, because we're playing within the game and interacting and describing things within the game. So it doesn't need you to be alive or dead. It doesn't matter. But this interaction is either happening or not happening, and you can describe it accurately or not accurately. And it's just an interaction. Your interaction has nothing more than I explain it. It is or isn't. I can explain it as best I can, and I can only go beyond a certain point. Sort of like infinite digits going after say a number like pi. You can only explain it to a certain extent, but just because it doesn't mean you can't explain it thoroughly doesn't mean there's no end. There's no actual number there. There's an actual number there, and you can contrive a way to cut it off. And that's what we do. We explain things to a certain extent, to a reasonable expectation. And that's exactly what we're doing, is explaining things as best we can. And things exist in this reality regardless. Sort of like numbers exist, this exists, that exists, this interaction, this relationship exists. And it doesn't need us to have it doesn't need our explanation, our perception, our senses to perceive it. It doesn't need our explanation. It doesn't need us to understand it, because these are things within the game, the reality that we're experiencing. And it doesn't need this interaction, and the interaction exists in and of itself, but it doesn't need that interaction, the explanation, these words that are baseless, that have nothing to do with the thing that we may be describing. It's just words coming out of our mouth. The interaction exists. I'm describing that. The interaction where I'm describing and recognizing what I'm describing exists, but it doesn't mean anything beyond that. Because our words, sort of like looking for new revelations, is based on this mechanism of this thing that's causing us to keep looking, the mechanism driving us, sort of like the mechanism that we wonder if we can describe something completely and utterly accurately. It exists, it doesn't need your interaction, and this interaction is disconnected from the thing that you're describing, because it's based on a subjective standard, based on an interaction that's happening in and of itself, and this existence that's disconnected from the thing that you're existing, unless you think that we're all in one reality, we're all in the game. So obviously we're still existing in the game regardless, and we're explaining something as best we can. And that's all we can do. It's still an interaction inside the game, and the interaction's all that matters. The fact that it exists, and your interaction in of itself, explaining from your point of view, doesn't mean anything beyond the interaction. Sort of like you're describing something. It doesn't mean anything beyond the interaction of your voice describing something in a way that you find the projection finds adequate, or you describe it the best way you can. So the words coming out of your mouth are disconnected from the thing where the words are coming from the thing that you're perceiving. The words that you say are inaccurate to your thought process and interaction with the thought process from your projection. And it's a disconnect based on the very reality that there's an interaction, but the interaction doesn't mean anything on a different level other than the fact that these things exist regardless of your interaction of, say, explaining something or not explaining something, sort of like looking for something beyond a certain point or not. These things exist based on their interaction and their existence alone, and your interaction with it, say your explanation within this reality, describing it, doesn't mean anything beyond the interaction, other than getting through life and explaining something as best you can. So I think I made the point good enough. So thank you, and until next time, bye.